Assalamu alaikum and good evening this 20th of July, and Spiritual Reflections is being brought to you in partnership with Cezire Derneği, Cyprus Islamic Association. Today we have, on the anniversary of 1974, 20th of July, we'll be looking at the Cyprus conflict and other conflicts. Our respected guests today are Ertan Karpazlı, journalist, British-born Turkish Cypriot; Cezire Derneği, founder, Mustafa Qureshi, an historian, and also have from South London, Ali Mullah, and he's a teacher as well. Thanks for being on the show. Hope you're well.
Thank you.
So for a lot of people who are watching today, it's the 20th of July, and for those who remember and those who don't remember, this is a day when Turkish armed forces landed in the northern part of Cyprus, near Girne, and to bring an end to a lot of years of tyranny. And so I'm going to go straight to you, Mustafa Qureshi. And what happened on the 20th of July 1974, and why did it happen?
Okay, first of all, congratulations to all the Turkish Cypriots out there, Yeni Temmuz and Kutlu olsun. I'm going to answer the first part of that, the second part of that question first, which is why and what led to 1974. Because often in the media, particularly in the British media and Western media, we get to hear about the 20th of July 1974. Turkish army comes to northern Cyprus, island gets split, and the island remains divided today. And with that kind of narrative, starting from that date, it certainly gives a one-sided view of what happened there. So we need to go back to the ideology behind what happened, what led to the conflicts in Cyprus. And we can take this back to the independence of Greece. Way back, we started in the Greek War of Independence in 1821. But according to the Ottomans, we call it Yunan isyanı. It was a Greek rebellion, because the Greeks were Ottoman citizens, as well as the Turks were, and many others. Christians, Muslims, it didn't matter. They were all part of the Ottoman Empire. But as a result of this rebellion, in the Mora Peninsula, Greece is established, and the Mora Peninsula is a small bit right in the southern tip of what we have now of the Hellenic Republic. The border had not yet expanded as much as it did to its present-day boundaries, but the force behind it, the ideological force behind it, was something called megali idea, which means a great idea. And the whole ideology behind that was to expand the borders of the Hellenic Republic, Greece, to lands which either have a significant Greek population or were part of the Byzantine Empire. So even places like the south of Italy, Istanbul, Izmir, Cyprus, the western coast of Anatolia, these were all included within the boundaries of the megali idea ideology. Hence, Turkey and Greece have had a lot of problems, even going back to the establishment of Turkey, where Greece actually took the western coast of Anatolia. And obviously there was a lot of issues there as well. But even in the mainland of Greece, we can't just think of Greece as a homogeneous area. There were 50% of the Balkans in the Ottoman time was Muslim. The Parthenon in Athens was used as a mosque by the Muslims. And the reason that it's in the poor state as it is now is because the Italians were the ones who bombed it, not the Muslims. The Muslims kept care of it. We have, in 1821, Greek peasantry massacred Turkish men, women, and children. And they were chanting that there will be no Turk left in the Mora. To kind of speed things up, Crete also had many Muslims. One-fourth, a quarter of Crete was Muslim. And today we're in a state where we don't have a single Muslim in Crete. The whole ideology behind that, again, was the megali idea, the great idea, right? And the result of the massacres that happened, not just in the Mora, but also particularly in Crete, was called by academics the Crete syndrome, which played a big part in Cypriot politics. Turkish Cypriots had a big case of the Crete syndrome because they were a minority at the time in Cyprus, and the Greek Cypriots were predominantly adherents to the Megali Idea ideology. And Cyprus, being part of Greece in particular, was called enosis, which means union in Greek. Now, this ideology started and spread in Cyprus since the days of the Greek War of Independence. In fact, many Greek Orthodox actually went to the Mora Peninsula and supported the Greeks of the peninsula to gain independence. They had the Greek Cypriot Brigade even had their own flag. So imagine these people who have been through war returned with this dangerous ideology to Cyprus, and they had the backing of the church. The Ottomans, in fact, and this ties in with the issues 274 as well, the Ottomans gave autonomy to various communities, and the communities were split not according to ethnicity but according to religion. So the head of the Greek Cypriot community was the head of the church. Now, after the Ottoman period, this community idea, these values, this what united them, which began with the millet system, continued, and it gave them the head start when the British era came in 1878. Now, when the British took over, it's important to note that the Bishop of Cyprus at the time said, we welcome the British to come, but the condition of this warm welcome was that the expectation of the Greek community in Cyprus would eventually have Cyprus to be united with Greece. So that was the expectation when the British came. Now, to speed things up there, often the two communities had a number of issues, but mainly led by the Greek church. And even the British noticed, Sir Garnet Wolseley said, I'm very anxious to get the Muslims on my side here, and I fear that they have been falsely told everywhere by those lying Greeks that the new Kitian governor means to keep the Turkish element down. Yeah. Now, there was a number of skirmishes, a number of attacks in certain villages, which I won't go into too much detail with. But we have in the 50s then an organization called AOKA. And that they're basically their initials, and it stands for National Organization of Cypriot Fighters. Now, naturally, when they talk about Cypriots here, they mean Greek Cypriots, because in those who hold the values of Enosis and the Megali Idea don't see the Turks of Cyprus as natives. They just see them as remnants of a conquering force. Now, this National Organization of Cypriot Fighters, AOKA, initially was targeting British soldiers. In fact, we have cemeteries in Cyprus of British soldiers which were targeted by these terrorists. But eventually the target started to increase to Turkish natives of the island. Because of the significant Turkish community in Cyprus, that was an obstacle. The Turks were the main obstacle to the Greek Cypriots obtaining their dream of enosis. And the attacks became violent and deadly against the Turkish Cypriots. To counter these attacks, the Turkish Cypriots had to create their own militia. At first, it wasn't very organized, and they had organizations such as Volkan, 9 Eylül Cephesi, Karaçete. But eventually, they started to get more organized, and with leading personnel from the Turkish Cypriot community, Dr. Fazıl Küçük, Rauf Denktaş, even Mufti Dana Efendi played a part in injecting the national impetus regarding the national struggle. And the result of the Enosis movement on the Turkish Cypriot community was that it built in the counter for that, which they called Taksim. And Taksim means to divide. in this sense, to divide the island to Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities, where they would both be safe in their own zones. Eventually, these groups became more organized, and they had support from Turkey as well, albeit underground support. And many of these soldiers, which the Turkish Cypriots called mujahid, which is the same as our audience may have heard from other Muslim communities who have their own national struggles, mujahid or mujahideen. It's the same word. It's the same word. A Muslim fighter fighting for God, fighting to protect his people, fighting for just cause. That is a mujahid. And they created TMT, Türk Mukavemet Teşkilatı, the Turkish resistance organization. And the way that these soldiers would pledge allegiance was secretly in a dark room. They would have the Turkish flag on a table, and they'd have a Quran, our noble Quran, on top of the flag, and they would hold a gun on top of the Quran, and that's how they would pledge their allegiance to this organization. And in fact, all of the Turkish Cypriot community, virtually all the Turkish Cypriot community, was involved in TMT, the counter militia, to fight against the EOKA militiamen. After independence in 1960, the Greek community was, in fact, it was more of a compromise, because the Greek community's aim was not for independence, and the Turkish Cypriots were weary of having the British to leave, because without the British, there was always that threat that they would be at the mercy of the majority community, and that enosis was always in the cards. In fact, the president, who was also the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox community, Makarios III, he even said upon the establishment of the Cyprus Republic that the Republic was never the aim, of their people, but it's one step closer to them reaching their aims. Now, not all of the Greek Cypriots were of the opinion to have enosis. There were Greek Cypriots who held a more left-wing ideology. Today we have the Akel party, for example. And many Greek Cypriots would even attack each other. Many of the left-wing Greek Cypriots were also killed and massacred as well. However, in 1963, 3 years after the establishment of the Cyprus Republic, we have the incident of what they call Bloody Christmas, Kanlı Noel. And often those that know about the event will think of what we have now in the Barbarlık Müzesi, the house with the bathtub of the mother with her children bloodied in the bathtub. But it extends to more than that. There were many conflicts in Gaymaklı and around Lefkoşa and around Cyprus. And there was many conflicts. Yes, Greek Cypriots did die as well. However, when we look at the numbers, there was, as a result of the Kanlı Noel atrocities, 25,000 Turkish Cypriots from 104 Turkish villages. That's roughly a quarter of the Turkish Cypriots there was displaced into enclaves. And they were no longer part of the parliament. So in effect, although officially the Republic of Cyprus was still active, the ideals in which, and the constitution on which the Republic was built on, had been finished just 3 years after its establishment. The Turkish Cypriots were no longer part of the decision-making process. And they had their own autonomous organizations. They had their own courts as well. And the Turkish Cypriots, even from the mixed villages, often would lead separate lives as well. Now, that's not to say that Turkish Cypriots, there weren't any Turkish Cypriots or Greek Cypriots that had good relations. They certainly were. There certainly were. But you have many examples of during the day where Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots would work together, would live side by side together. But as soon as nighttime fell, they would be fighting each other. And you had this kind of paradox, this strange kind of society that was built on, where during the day there was something else going on, and in the night it would be something else. Now, according to the United Nations General's Report, and the report number for those who want to search it up is S/5950, reported in September 1964. Records that the Cyprus government, i.e. the Greek Cypriot administration that was ruling the island, imported large amounts of arms and equipment, which came through Limassol, the docks in Limassol. An estimated 5,000 personnel from Greece also came in. This was in 1964. The arms and military equipment in excess of 3,000 tons left Limassol docks in some 1,000 loads. This was a time when the Greek Cypriots, or rather, should I say, the EOKA militia, the terrorists, would say, and you can correct me if my Greek is poor here, Galos Turkos είναι ο negros Turkos. A good Turk is a dead Turk. Now, if we fast forward to the 15th of July, 1974, the EOKA, as I mentioned, there was splits between the Greek Cypriots. You had the left wingers and the right wingers. Now, the pro-Enosis camp also had a division within themselves as well. You had what we say the Magarioscular, the people who were behind Magarios's strategy, because he was pro-Enosis. But you also had another individual called Grivas. He was a big, he killed many Turks. He actually was what they deemed a war hero in Greece as well. So you had a split between Grivas and Makarios. And Makarios' strategy was, we want Enosis. However, let's play it safe and have a slow process, step by step, and we'll get rid of the Turks. But the Grivas, the more Grivas and the ones who weren't aligned to Magarios, they felt that Magarios' strategy was wrong and it needed to be sped up. They needed to speed things up. So what they did was they ousted Makarios illegally, and they replaced him with what the Turks know as a butcher of the Turks, Nikos Samson. I believe he's from Famagusta, if I'm not mistaken.
He's from Vasili, Famagusta, yeah.
Vasili, yeah. And he was the de facto president for 5 days. Now, what this actually tells us, 5 days after, when we have the 20th of July, when Turkey came in, it was as a result of many years of these intercommunal violence, but more so the EOKA killing of Turks. And the TMT was founded in 1958, you have to remember. So there's many years in which they were trying to resolve this issue under the banner of the Cyprus Republic, and it just wasn't working. The Cyprus Republic was founded with 3 guarantor nations, that is Britain, Greece, and Turkey respectively. And Turkey was pushing, particularly to the UK, to come and support, so they can have a joint force to support peace in Cyprus. In fact, Bülent Ecevit was in Britain at the time of the 15th of July, and Necmettin Erbakan was leading things in Turkey. And as a result of the emergency that came place, you have the butcher of Turks, Nikos Samson, who has taken power, along with, it was not just Greek Cypriot militia who ousted Makarios, it was many Greek personnel from the Greek army, the Hellenic Republic, which were involved as well. This is a declaration of war. And as a result, Turkey sent troops to Cyprus to bring peace. And as Bülent Ecevit said, we are bringing peace not just for the Turks, but also for the Greeks, for the many Greeks that were killed from the left wingers and those who were in the Magarios camp as well. And that's why we have the 20th of July peace operation.
Thank you, Mustafa. Can I just, so you did explain to us the history behind, and it goes back to the founding of Greece, when the Turks see it as a rebellion. They see it as a war of independence, of course. And as you clearly stated, lots of Greek Cypriots took the cause as well and went to fight in the Greek war against the Ottoman Empire. You mentioned that after when EOKA is created, their aim is to rid the island of British rule, and also they saw the Turks as enemies as well, because they knew the Turks would oppose enosis, which means union with Greece. And then we have of course, all the parties come together, and Cyprus is given independence in a joint state with all the communities being represented. And in 1963, we also had an elected president, which was Greek Cypriot, Makarios, and a vice president, which was Turkish Cypriot, Dr. Fazıl Güçlü. And also, you made very clear about the 1963. So the republic only lasted like for 3 years, really, didn't it? And then it completely disintegrated when the Greek Cypriots took arms to implement enosis by attacking the Turkish Cypriots in December 1963. And then you mentioned that 104 villages were evacuated, or people were expelled, or they left because they were scared. And there was lots of crimes committed against Turkish Cypriots at the time. And I just want to share something with our audience as well. So if you look at the Daily Herald from London, and it was Peter Moorhead reporting from a village called Skillura on the 1st of January 1964, we have just like some idea of what was happening in Cyprus to the besieged Turkish Cypriots. So this is in an English newspaper, and it says, Daily Herald, London, on the 1st of January 1964, in a silent village in one night of terror, 350 men, women and children have vanished. And the story says, in this village of shame today, I found grim evidence of the hatred between Greek and Turk that has bewildered this beautiful island. A few days ago, 1,000 people lived here in their solid stone-built homes, which hug the coast road to Girne, Kyrenia, 13 miles from Nicosia. Then in a night of terror, 350 villagers, men, women and children, vanished. They were all Turkish. Today, I was one of the 2 British correspondents to drive to the village to investigate the mystery. In the dusty village street, I found hungry Greek children playing listlessly. From doorways, men and women eyed me suspiciously. When I asked where the Turks are, the women averted their gaze. The men shuffled their feet and said, we don't know. They just left. So this was happening like over 103 villages across the island. And then we have, as you said, 1/3 of the population refugees in their own homeland. And this continues, isn't it, for many years. So this continues up to 1974. And then you didn't mention the 1967, 1968 attacks by Grivas on Geçitkale, Kofino, and Ayathedoros, which was Aitotoro. So there was attacks on them. Also, Turkey did try to intervene, didn't they, in 1964? They did send some jets, and they pounded the Greek Cypriot positions.
Yeah, it was more of a warning, wasn't it?
Was there just before 1974? Just so our audience can know as well, did Makarios try to change the situation after the 1967-1960 attack by Grivas? Was there like a change towards? Was there a change of heart towards the Turkish Cypriot enclaves just before 1974?
I'm not sure about the exact details, but what I do know is after, as you mentioned, when Turkey sent their jets to Cyprus, it wasn't. I don't believe it was to intervene, but it was more as a warning. I believe that, as far as I know, Makarios did soften a little bit, but as far as I understand it, he was still very much pro-enosis, but he was very careful in the way he would do it. Obviously, he now saw that Turkey would get involved militarily if they were to take things further.
Thank you, Mustafa. And we'll speak a little bit after about what happened after the 20th of July, 1974. Thanks for that interesting information on our history. I'm going to go to Ali Mullah now. Ali, as a Turkish Cypriot born in the UK, what does the 20th of July represent or mean to Turkish Cypriots today, especially those living in the UK?
That's a really good question, actually, because amongst us, there's such a wide, there's such a wide spectrum of people, and the amount that we're educated and what we know and what we overlook in today's climate, it kind of you find such a wide spectrum of people's understanding and what it means to us as well. And I often wonder that, because growing up myself, I would say that I grew up in quite a neutral family. So neutral in a sense that, I was sort of never grown to hate or to be overly what's the word, nationalistic. Yeah. So, and we've grown up with so many Greek friends as well as Turkish Cypriot friends. So for us, it's 20th of July is a day of liberation, and it's a day when it's spoken about, we speak about Turkey, who came over and intervened and saved us from complete ethnic cleansing. But I do wonder, what does it mean to people today? Not just people that are young, a lot younger than myself and yourself, and because we have a lot of people that are now second and third generation in this country. But what does it mean to people that are my age and your age today as well? Because of the current climate and the way sort of politics work around the world today. On top of that, the fact that we're so desensitized with so many wars that happen constantly, that we kind of completely leave out, don't we? We kind of completely forget the importance of things. And I've got friends that will tell me, oh, that was a long time ago. That's old news, and we should be looking forward now. And I believe that as well. To be honest, I think every one of us here wants to see a peaceful solution, and we all want to move forward. But today, I don't want to sort of raise politics too much here, but today, the things that are happening are not very different. So the last 50 years, I've not seen very much change. If we look at what happened with the exploration of gas in the Mediterranean today, the current tactics being employed by the Greeks are not very different than what they've been over the past 50 years. So, and I remember I was just a couple of weeks ago, I was watching a speech by Çavuşoğlu, Foreign Minister for Turkey, and he's saying, look, and this is a speech at the UN. He's saying, look, at the moment, we are always open to to peaceful talks, and the idea is that we share the resources of this island equally or fairly amongst us. Yeah, but there's a constant denial of that. So what I'm trying to get at, the fact is, 20th July for me is a point where it's a peace was brought to the island, in like you said, Ecevit's statement about how it was to bring peace to the Turks and to the Greeks as well. That's fair. And as much as the press have labeled it as an invasion, we should always reflect on the fact that we call that Barış Harekatı. For us, it's an intervention for peace. And that's how I see it personally. But how do our people remember that? And as I say, because we're so desensitized, we look at what goes on in China today, and it's like it comes in through one ear and it goes out the other, because we're so used to hearing bad news. Last week we spoke about was it before we spoke about Bosnia?
Yeah.
Today we should be speaking about Palestine as well, and we should be speaking about Burma and all those places where atrocities are happening right now. But it goes in one ear and it comes out the other because of the fact that we're so desensitized. And our own people right now, my worry is that a generation is about to die. So the generation above us will soon die. And when that happens, we're left with a bunch of people that wants to move forward, but you haven't really recognized your past. And again, this is not coming from a nationalistic perspective. I don't have that. And I'm sure, I don't think any of us really do. To be honest, we're seekers of peace in many ways. Knowing all three of you, I know that. That's what it means to me. So my worry is, how do we move forward if we don't really know our past? And because of the current climate in the world, sort of current media and current politics, we don't sort of look at the past. We're always looking at the now. So that's what it means to me.
You've brought up some interesting points. One of your last points was if you don't teach your next generation, you're saying that they will forget about the events that happened?
Well, whenever I speak to friends, they'll tell me that the education in the South is very different than what it is in the North.
Of course.
And obviously, I shouldn't really commentate on that, and I don't know it. I'm not a historian that Mustafa is, and I'm not a political commentator that Ertan is either. So it's hard for me to say exactly what goes on. I don't know, but from what I understand is there's a very nationalistic approach in the South, and there's a hatred towards Turkey. And whenever I've sort of debated with people about, sort of the ongoings of 74 and prior to that, 1950s and 60s, they are very dismissive about what happens. And I think it's because that's probably just not taught in their school systems, or it's completely overlooked. Some of the atrocities and the actions are completely overlooked. And it comes down to the invasion. And there's never a precursor to that invasion. It's always, this is why we hate people from Turkey. But what's your reason for it? So I find that sometimes the Greek people I speak to, and to some extent the Turks, who are now just not reflective of that as well, because we want to look forward and we don't want to hold on to our past, that we're losing that. We don't have the perspective. And how can we go forward with that perspective? Without a perspective, should I say? How can we have a union? How can we talk about peace and going forward if there's no sort of no acknowledgement of what's happened before? I spoke to someone recently who said, the Germans completely forgot. The Germans completely apologized for the actions of the world wars. Sometimes I read and I see that ex-foreign minister of Turkish Cypriots, I think it was a lady, I've forgotten her name. He said, we should be apologetic and we should be sorry for what we did to the Turks in the 1960s and 70s. But that's not the consensus amongst them.
That was when she said that only when she was out of parliament.
Yes, I know. Yes, it was definitely when she was no longer in it. But it's a shame that that's not the consensus. And without that, how do we go forward when there's a complete denial of everything that's happened in the past? On top of that as well, we have an uneducated public right now. And, for example, I don't want to criticize, but, for example, our Turkish schools, we have so many sort of national days and so many celebrations that go from week to week. And the things that we teach are kind of, there's only so much you can teach kids that are sort of 8, 9, 10 anyway, who might study for 1 to 3 hours on a Saturday. So our form of sort of teaching our youth and educating them is not really helping them understand where they've come from either. And as I said, I'm not nationalistic, and I'm not saying this to dwell on the past, on that sort of point. But what I'm trying to say is, because we don't know, we don't. A lot of us, my opinion of us today as Turkish Cypriots is, we don't really have an opinion. Yeah, and we're very friendly with our Turkish neighbours, and we should be. I don't see a problem with that at all. And I'd hoped it was the same, because the Greek Cypriots that I meet are just like myself. They're sort of very accommodating. We can be very friendly. That's not a problem. But there isn't really a basis to go forward because there's no acknowledgement of what's really happened, and but today politically it's exactly the same. So all the stops are put out, every single opportunity to hinder the Turks in our development. And if you're not seeing us as equals today, whether that's sort of flights or recognition, or whether it's drilling for gas in the Mediterranean, or whether it's just sort of power sharing, if we're talking about a bilateral state, then how can we move forward if there isn't a recognition that we are equal opportunity, we are sort of equally as human as yourselves? So that's my point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic points you brought up for someone who's Turkish Cypriot living in the UK. I totally agree. And I totally agree as well that even in the Turkish Cypriot schools here, there is a lack of knowledge about what happened, about our history. Yes, I mean, Mustafa, within a few minutes, gave us such a deep-rooted history, going back right to the end of the Ottoman Empire. And the only things that we teach children is 1974, July 1974, but what happened before 1974?
We don't even touch on these topics in secondary schools now.
And I think that's the difference between the South as well. The South do have a more nationalistic approach, which I don't think is a good thing as well, because it breeds hatred. There is a lot of hatred. So if you go to a lot of the Greek Cypriot Facebook pages today, you'll see lots of very, very negative and very, very nasty comments, because they are seeing Cyprus, the problem and the conflict, or July 1974, according to their own narration of things as well. And a lot of them do not acknowledge the atrocities committed against the Turkish Cypriots. And these atrocities are well documented. I just read just one newspaper cutting from 1963, 1964. But, you know, the island was not a sunny place of happiness. There was lots of terrible things happening there. Lots of people were missing, and people were denied access. But you also mentioned that even until today, we're still living on embargoes. So a lot of Turkish Cypriots think that the embargoes placed on Turkish Cypriots are because of the creation of the TINC, or the Cyprus Federate Cumhuriyet, which was founded in 1975. It's not. We have been under embargo since 1963, and they've never been lifted. I did want to mention that thing because I did read somewhere, or I know that after 1971-72, Margaros did try to lift some of those embargoes on Turkish Cyprus. Unfortunately, he didn't do a very good job, and he really saw his life lost as well in the process. I'm going to go to Ertan now. This is going to be an interesting one. Ertan, how does what Turkish Cypriots experienced in the lead up to 1974 compare to the suffering of other communities like our own?
Well, that's a very good question, and the best I can do is really give my opinion, which probably a lot of people would disagree with. But when we look at what happened in Cyprus in 1974 and the lead up to that, I think it's wrong to look at it as an isolated case. We need to look at it as a conflict among other conflicts in a historical context. And I believe Mustafa touched on a lot of that historical context in his answer. But just to kind of expand on that, if we focus particularly in the last 200 years, let's say, starting from the beginning of the downfall of the Ottoman Empire in the early 1800s, up until I'd say perhaps the 1990s or year 2000, in the Balkan Wars, you know, with the collapse of Yugoslavia and what happened there. If we look at what's been happening those past 200 years, what we'll actually find is that in the region that was once controlled by the Ottoman Empire, or once at least a region where the Ottomans had, if not direct control, but a degree of soft power, in those regions, since the beginning of the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, we've seen a number of massacres and ethnic cleansing and displacements, in which the victims have usually been Muslims, predominantly Turkish Muslims, but not limited to that. And besides being Muslim, the one thing that these people have had in common actually is that during the time of the Ottoman Empire, they were loyal to the Ottoman Empire. And another thing that they have in common is that more often than not, the perpetrators of the atrocities against them have been, for better or worse, have been Orthodox Christians. And whether that be, for example, the displacement of the Ahıska Turks and the Circassian Turks from the Caucasus region, whether that be the displacement and exile of Crimean Tatars from Crimea, which is southern Ukraine. It could be, for example, the genocides and massacres that we witnessed against the Bosniaks and other Muslims of the Balkans. Also, as Mustafa mentioned, the Turkish Muslims who were massacred in Mora, in the Peloponnese Peninsula in southern Greece, and even the Greek Muslims of Crete and the other Asian islands who were forced to leave their homelands. And we're not talking about ethnic Turks who migrated there at some point in history. We are talking about native populations who adopted Islam and by doing so became loyal to the Ottoman Empire, who were displaced from their homelands just because of their religion. And the intention behind some of these atrocities has been different. In some cases, yes, it has actually been done in the name of the cross, in the name of Christianity. In other cases, it was done in the name of communism and atheism. But it doesn't change the fact that the perpetrators of these crimes have traditionally identified themselves as Orthodox Christians, and the victims of these crimes have traditionally identified themselves as Muslims, whether they're religious or not. That's a different issue. So I believe that, say, 200 years from now, when historians look back on these incidents, and starting from the end of the Ottoman Empire until the 1990s, the prism from which they're going to look at it is they are going to actually summarize it as an Orthodox Christian war against Muslims, predominantly Turkish Muslims. And I believe that the Cyprus conflict will be put into that category, for better or worse. Now, I've talked about a number of different people who have suffered within this the context of these wars that have been happening the last 200 years. And actually, if we compare our suffering to theirs, I think that we've actually got off quite lightly. We've actually been quite lucky in a sense, because we didn't suffer like the Crimean Tatars, who were exiled from their homeland for 70 years by Joseph Stalin during the Soviet Union. They were exiled. Imagine, for 70 years, you don't even step foot in your country. We're talking about generations and generations who have been born outside of that homeland. Yet, when when the Soviet Union collapsed, these Crimean Tatars were allowed to return to Crimea. And now we have 300,000 Crimean Tatars living in Crimea once again. So they held on to that dream of returning to their homeland after 70 years. Like the Ahyskas, for example, the Ahyska Turks, who are originally from what is mainland, which is Georgia today. But they were also exiled by the Russians, say about 200 years ago, if not less. And even today, there is not one single Ahyska Turk living in the homeland of Georgia. For 200 years, these people have been living in complete exile. They exist only as a diaspora. And I had the chance to actually meet Ahyska Turks for the first time when I was living in Istanbul. I went to a student fair where there were a number of international students who had come with their flags and costumes and different cuisines to kind of show off their country and culture. Some of the students come from countries that today exist, and some of them were representing a diaspora which no longer has a country. So I saw the Ahyska Turks, and I got the chance to meet with them and talk with them, and they explained to me that for 200 years, they've been exiled from their homeland. They've not been able to return, but after 200 years, even the youth of the Ahyska today, whether they live in America or Europe or Russia, wherever they are, they still keep that dream alive that one day they're going to return to their homeland. And I think, in fact, the government of Georgia has recently started doing tours for elderly Ahyskas who want to go back and just visit like where they were originally from, even like places like Sochi, in Russia, in the Caucasus. So these people have suffered so much. Even the Western Thrace Turks, up until the 1990s, they were living under quarantine. They were not allowed to integrate with wider Greek society. Western Thrace is now in Greece. The Cretan Muslims are still living in exile in Syria. They've not been able to return after 120 years. They've not been able to return to Crete. Now, compare our suffering to the suffering of those who I've just mentioned. They've suffered for the same reason. They've suffered within the same context that we've suffered. But the difference between us and them is that whereas their suffering was very impactful, very it happened all at once, and they were very heavily traumatized by what happened to them. We, on the other hand, we have suffered very slowly, very gradually over a longer period of time. And I believe that suffering began with the British, under the British era, and continued during the years of the Republic of Cyprus, let's say up until 1974. And we've been fortunate in a way that other people have not been fortunate, in terms of we've had what we call Anavatan, or motherland, Turkey, which has been willing and capable to come in and kind of rescue us when we needed to be rescued. But unfortunately, Turkey did not have the ability to do the same for the Ahyskas or for the Crimean Tatars or you know, other Turkish and other Muslim communities elsewhere in former Ottoman lands. So we've been very fortunate in that way. But at the same time, I think that we've not been grateful enough as well, in terms of other people who have suffered more so than we have suffered, have after 200 years been able to hold on to their identity, have been able to hold on to that dream of working together and achieving a goal. Whereas we have kind of just allowed Turkey to come in and be like, oh yeah, Turkey's going to do everything for us. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to think. We don't need to act. We don't need to work. And that is not the correct approach. So I personally take inspiration from the people who I've mentioned who have suffered greatly. And I've seen how they're working together still, even the Ahyskas, despite being sporadically separated all over the world, they still have their associations, they still have their meetings, they still have their congresses, they still have their hierarchies. I've taken a lot of inspiration from them as a Turkish Cypriot, and I would like to see Turkish Cypriots today learn a lesson from that and start implementing and start working for themselves instead of expecting Turkey to do everything for them. So yeah, I think that's how we compare.
Some really, really good, valid and interesting points. And so last week, the whole world remembered, well, those who remembered, those who turned a blind eye is another thing. But Europe commemorated one of the worst atrocities on its continent, which was the massacre of Srebrenica, where 8,000 to 9,000 men, 99.9% Muslim men, were massacred. And this was this actually brought the war to an end, didn't it, Ertan? It was the last great massacres that took place. But I totally agree. The reason I brought that up is when you say about other communities who have been suffering, the Palestinians have been suffering for so many years. And I wonder if we could have just I don't know if Turkish Cypriots would have lasted that long if we, but I mean, even the Bosnians, so from 1992 to 1996, that's a long time to suffer. And there was like really, really terrible ethnic cleansing, and to an extent, something that was not even seen in Cyprus. Yes, we had massacres, and there was terrible massacres right to the last day, wasn't there? On the 14th of August, we saw entire villages, men, women, and children, murdered and buried in mass graves. In other villages, all the men folk were taken, never to be seen again. Only recently have bodies been discovered and been laid to rest. It's very similar to Bosnia, but Bosnia was a large scale. I think Bosnia also teaches Turkish Cypriots a lesson, doesn't it? Can you trust other people to look after you, to guarantee your safety? That's one thing I always say to Turkish Cypriots in Cyprus when I debate. The Bosnian Muslims were in Europe. This was allowed to happen in Europe. The United Nations was there, safeguarding them. And I just want to, before we end the show and the last questions to my respected, I just want to read something from Bosnia. So when the Bosnian Serb commander on the 6th of May 1993 gave this statement to the Daily Telegraph, said, "We are Christians fighting on two fronts, against re-emerging fascism and the rise of Islam in Europe." Serb Muslims were being killed in Bosnia because of their race and their religion. And I also want to say this as well, that again, the Daily Telegraph on the 6th of May 1993 says the symbols were of wars won and lost. The Bosnian Serb army commander wore peaked caps styled from the Balkan Wars. Their honor guard chanted songs of defiance to Turkish rule, saying, "Come, let us slaughter the sons of the Turks." I won't read the next part because it's very upsetting of how people were killed. But we need to learn lessons from this, that we're very, very lucky that we do have a motherland that has protected us and come to our rescue, because a lot of people don't. And we saw over 500,000 people killed in the former Yugoslavia. Both of you, I want to ask you this question. Do you think the troubles in Cyprus could have been handled better at the time?
Yep, shall I go first?
Yes, please, Mustafa.
Yeah. I won't say at the time it's difficult. It's a difficult one, and it's maybe easy to say in after how many years, after 40 odd years. But I think the way we could have handled it better in the more global sense of things. You mentioned Bosnia, for example, in the heart of Europe, where native Europeans were killed, and this was allowed to happen. And as you mentioned, it was a kind of clash of civilizations, and even the Bosnians have a song from that time where they say "Mujahideen Turski Sin," which means the Mujahideen are the sons of the Turks. And it doesn't mean many Turks from Turkey often take it to mean that it's referring to Turks from Turkey coming over. That's not what it means here. What they mean by Turks is Muslim, and what they mean by the Mujahideen are their own Mujahideen. That we are the soldiers, the sons of the Muslims, the sons of the Ottomans, and that's what they're referring to. And to understand this concept better, and I'm going to get to the point, I would advise our respected guests and viewers to read a book called Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington, and they'll be able to explain this concept better. There's an English proverb, where they say birds of a feather flock together. Now, in 1974, when Turkey was going to come and save the Turks of the island, the leader of Libya at the time, Muammar Gaddafi, he offered to send jets to support Turkey, to support the Turkish Cypriots for peace, and Turkey refused. And after 1974, again Muammar Gaddafi, he also sent mosques. There was the religious institution built on the main road that was paid for by Gaddafi. The Günaydın newspaper in May 1977. In fact, Gaddafi said to the international community that Turkey has brought peace and law to the island. Furthermore, Mohammed Safet as-Sakka Amini, he was representing the Arabita al-Alam al-Islami, the Islamic gathering which they have annually. And he wrote a book about what he spoke about in 1982 called Kubrus al-Muslima, Muslim Cyprus. He mentions that Denktash is a Mujahid leader. And he mentions the plight of the Turkish Cypriots and the destructions of the mosques. And he gives a very excellent and comprehensive detail of what happened to the Turkish Cypriots. And it was originally written in Arabic, but it's been translated into English as well. Oh, sorry, Turkish. It's been translated to Turkish as well. In another Muslim country, Saudi Arabia has paid for large roads in northern Cyprus. And there was meant to be a giant mosque built in Güzelyurt as well. It's not as big as it should have been, but that's another story altogether. The point I'm trying to get at is that Turkey refusing at that time, because maybe Turkey was more looking at it from a Turkish, this is a Turkish cause. And we mentioned in some other talks as well, where we need to, as a community, as a nation, come to terms with that we have different aspects of our identity. By saying that we're Turks does not mean that we're no longer Muslim, or saying that you're Muslim does not mean that you're any less of a Turk. We need to come to a balance and find out that one is a national identity and one is an ethnic identity. And even if you don't believe in the tenets of Islam, your heritage is from the Muslims. And hence, Huntington in his book, The Clash of Civilizations, says that although you may have other ideologies, for example, communism came and gave a brief pause to the human desire to support people in their tribe. Eventually, it will still come down to which civilization you belong to. And if Turkey had not just seen it as a Turkish cause, but had allowed other Muslims who were willing to help and were helping after 74 and are still supporting us, had they allowed them to fully allow it to become a Muslim cause as well as a Turkish cause, I believe that we would have been in a stronger position today. And in fact, the Greek Cypriots are playing the civilizational card, and the Europeans, and we're living in the UK, and we always see that they say Turkish invasion, and they always talk about 20th of July, but nothing about what happened before then. Naturally, the British were targeted by Aoka, as I mentioned before, and yet they've let that pass. In Larnaca, in the pier, they have a statue symbolizing the Venetian era. The Venetians oppressed the Greek Cypriots, and yet it's all forgotten about. Why? Because they're Christian. They belong to the same civilization. In 1983, when the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus was announced, there was a confidential telegram sent by the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Sir Geoffrey Howe, who was from the British Embassy. For those who want to find this confidential telegram, you can reference WSC 014/11. And it was a telegram on the 18th of November 1983 from the British Foreign Office. And he says, "We have heard from various sources that following the Turkish Cypriot Declaration of Independence, some countries may be prepared to recognize the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus as an independent sovereign state. These countries may include Bangladesh, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Libya, and Malaysia." And in fact, Pakistan and Bangladesh both briefly did recognize the independence of the TRNC. So how we could have handled things in 74 and beyond, to wrap it up, is let our natural allies, our natural friends, our natural brothers support us. Let them support us in this cause. Why are we chasing the allies of the Greek Cypriot side?
Thank you, Mustafa. And for our viewers, thanks for that information as well. And for our viewers, in 1974, as Mustafa stated, Turkey was not alone. Turkey did have support. Libya was actually prepared to also give fuel to accommodate the Turkish Cypriot Turkish armed forces. Iran, which was under the Shah at the time, Persia, offered medical aid and tents and medical assistance to the Turkish armed forces. Pakistan also supported Turkey, and we still see that kind of support still. They still support us, but unfortunately they did back down from recognition when they were put under pressure from the United Nations and the Commonwealth. Ertan, before we close, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. In terms of what can Turkey or Turkish Cyprus, what we could have done better since that time, I'm going to be a bit cheeky here and say that I think the public relations side of the military operation on July 20th could have been a lot better. I feel that as Turks, we have always struggled in terms of how to explain our side of the story to the world. And we still suffer from this today, actually. We see with the examples of the Turkish operations in Syria and Libya and Iraq. We're always coming under this heavy criticism from Western media. And obviously, Western media, you will have those individuals who have that intention, they have that agenda, and you can't change their mind no matter what you do. But I think half of that is down to us not being able to explain our side of the story properly. And it's the same case for Cyprus. Now, it really, to be honest, it does break my heart that so many Greek Cypriots today are refugees. Because there was absolutely, if you ask me, there was absolutely no reason for them to leave their homes. And I believe that if Turkey had conducted some kind of public relations strategy properly, the Greek Cypriots would have actually been reassured that the operation that Turkey commenced on July 20th was actually to bring peace, that they were not in danger. Turkey was not targeting civilians. In fact, Turkey's war was alone against Aoka and the Greek military junta, which themselves were killing Greek Cypriot civilians. So actually, Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots were and should have been on the same side in this conflict. But unfortunately, that wasn't communicated properly to the Greek Cypriots. They did feel that they were in danger, and they did flee to areas where they felt safer. And I believe that was completely unnecessary. And imagine if Turkey had actually conducted themselves properly regarding the public relations side of the operation, imagine what kind of Cyprus we'd be living in today. It would be a lot better than the Cyprus that we're living in now, I think. And Turkey would definitely have a lot more control and a lot more say in mainstream media in terms of its role in the Cyprus conflict today. So that's actually one of the reasons why I got into journalism myself as a Turkish Cypriot, because I realized that we do have this weakness in terms of explaining our side of the story, and it's something that I do my best to do, particularly on social media, on Twitter. And more often than not, I'm doing it alone, and you know, I don't always get the support that I need. I do have a lot of critics, I will admit that. But believe it or not, through my work, I have actually opened the eyes to a lot of Greek Cypriots who didn't know our side of the story before I started telling them in a way that they would understand. And I've actually got a lot of Greek Cypriot supporters now on Twitter, on social media, who, even if they disagree with my version of events or my side of the story, they still at very least respect me as a Turkish Cypriot and respect me as somebody who speaks in many ways on behalf of the Turkish Cypriot and explains that side of the narrative. Just today, I shared a number of videos from a documentary that was made in 1974 about the conflict, and I've actually got Greek Cypriots retweeting me on Twitter and saying that after watching those videos and reading my tweets, that they no longer feel that animosity and hatred towards the Turks that they did do beforehand. And it's little things like this, little steps like this we can take in terms of explaining ourselves properly that can even make the Greek Cypriots realize that we're not here to hurt them, we're not against them. You know, this is not a war of Turks versus Greeks. We are actually, as human beings, on the same side, and you know, that might actually help us build towards a better dialogue with them in the future.
Thank you very much. We do see eye to eye on this. The last topic you said, I totally agree. Things could have been much better, because we did see also, we edge of its words were, we're coming to Cyprus to bring peace. We will not open fire unless we are open fired upon us. And that's where I think it went completely wrong. Unfortunately, the Greeks did take arms and they did attack the forces. They also terrorized a lot of Turkish Cypriot villages. And once the Turkish armed forces took ground, it wasn't only Greeks as well. Even Maronites fled their villages, and who were not even part of the war. So there is unfortunately, in both Cypriot camps, Turkish and Greek, and Maronite as well, there are years and years of legendary hatred and fears that were amongst people. Because I even asked my parents, who weren't even in Cyprus in 1963. My mum wasn't inside in 1963, but she tells me that in 1958, people would go to sleep with like forks and different type of arms, whatever they could make, because they always feared the Greeks would one day come to attack their villages. And I'm sure the Greeks also had the fear that the Turk from Turkey will come. So there was always this age-old animosity, deeply enrooted, and it goes back to what Mustafa Qureshi said. It stems back to the rebellion of Greece against the Ottoman Empire, and also the War of Independence, and of course what happened in Anatolia that had an effect on Cyprus. I want to thank everybody who watched this program. It was actually watched by a lot of people. It's an interesting topic. We will do the second part of this on the 14th of August, hopefully, which will be the second part of the military operation in Cyprus, and also one of the saddest parts of the operation, because on the 14th of August, we lost the majority of people on that day as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alimullah. Thank you, Mustafa Qureshi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ertan Karpazlı, for enlightening us about the topics as well. And thank you, everyone, for watching. And we'll be back next week with a different topic on spiritual reflections. Have a good evening.